Welcome, everyone. This is the third session of How Poskim Come to Know Reality with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. And with this, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Ziring.
Okay, so last week, not surprisingly, we didn't manage to make it through all the sources because there's so much to talk about. But just to recap where we are, because each week really does build on what we've seen in the past. So over the last 2 weeks, what we set up was the basic common sense notion that that every halachic question requires the integration of an assessment of reality, because halacha doesn't just imply in theory; it has to apply to the real world. And that requires us to somehow um, figure out how poskim assess the reality. And we set up several models. So we set up two models essentially where poskim abdicate their control over their assessment of reality. One was the outsourcing model, which we got from the Yom Kippur text, where the understanding is that if someone's life is in danger, they're allowed to eat a Yom Kippur. The way we figure that out is by asking a doctor. So the assessment of reality is part of the halachic process, but it's assessed by someone other than the rabbi, but then the posek. Then there was the model based on the sunset case, where if rabbis determine that the sun has set and they're wrong, so then Shabbat is still not over. And the Gemara says that's not even a hora'ah. It's not called a halachic decision. It's called a mistake. And that model suggested that in a certain sense, reality is simply outside the purview of halachic authority. It is what it is, which obviously means that poskim don't control it. Then at the other extreme, we noted the model that emerges from the Rambam, and then last week we deepened that with Reb Chaim David HaLevi, that judges are supposed to know a little bit of basically every discipline, which while we could take that in a minimalist fashion, some, as we saw again, like Reb Chaim David HaLevi, take it in a maximalist fashion, that poskim actually have to become like Nobel Prize winners in every discipline, and that both gives them, and we talked about different benefits of it last week, it gives them control over it, it gives them flexibility, it prevents outside bias from coming into the halachic system. We noted the translation model, where poskim are allowed to have translators, but only if they know how to understand what the litigants or maybe the witnesses are saying, and that notion that you have to know how to understand the language, but not necessarily to speak it, that mid-level proficiency, where you're not at the mercy of the outside experts, but you're still not claiming full expertise yourself. That's yet another model. And then last week we noted, based on Rabbi Clapper's read of the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which holds back halachic authority from Rav, even though he's clearly the expert both in the halachic theory around the assessment of blemishes in animals, but also has the most experience in terms of he lived with 18 months with a shepherd, and therefore is shown to be an expert in the reality. He's not given authority, which, while there are different models to understand that, Rabbi Clapper took it as a possible model that we actually don't want poskim to have all expertise wrapped up in one, because it makes them not understandable to others, it makes them not answerable to others, and that itself is problematic. And that's where we had mostly left off last week. What I want to do now is ask a few questions, right? One, I want to figure out, okay, especially the sources that focus on smicha, and focus on the original authority of Beit Din, they're presenting a certain idealized version of what halacha was when it had its maximal authority, and its maximal power. We have to ask whether poskim in all generation are created equal. We already saw last week that Reb Chaim David HaLevi seems to answer that question as a yes, that while maybe nowadays halachic authorities don't have the same power as the courts once did, in principle, the requirements for a court are still requirements for the poskim that we have, and therefore they should strive to mimic that level of expertise. But as we're going to see, that is not so obvious. And it could be that there are different models of psak, those that exist in the time of, let's say, the Talmud and before, and those that exist nowadays. So I'll pull up the sources now. 1 second. Share. Okay. There we go. Okay. To wait for it to get up on the screen. There we go. So, my late teacher, Aaron Lichtenstein, in an article called "Legitimization of Modernity," and we'll see why he calls it this in just a minute, argued the following: the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, once quoted his father, Rav Moshe Zichrono Livracha, to the effect that the nature of psak had altered drastically when formal classical smicha had been terminated. Originally, a samuch, at least on the Rambam's view, that smicha applies to horat, isur, ve'heter as well as to din. Right? The Rambam holds that the power of smicha applies both to ritual law and not just monetary law, even though the primary role of a samuch is on the court. Would pronounce a decision which was binding by dint of his authoritative fiat. Subsequently, however, a posek's personal status was vitiated, and with it, the standing of his decisions. Now he essentially serves as a reference guide, providing reliable information about what the tradition and its sources properly understood and interpreted state, but it is in turn they rather than he which bind authoritatively. So Rav Lichtenstein quotes a tradition that the authority of those with the original smicha, the members of the courts, it wasn't just they were really knowledgeable, but they actually they were vested with personal authority, right? They had a status, they had power, and therefore, when they issued a halachic ruling, it was binding because they said it, right? That itself had power. And now he argues that that's not true. Now, poskim act basically as really good source material. They know what the tradition says, they know how to analyze it, but what's binding is not the person. What's binding is the information that they convey, meaning if you are compelled that they are correct in their read of the tradition, then it is the tradition that binds you, not the person who conveyed to you what they thought the tradition meant. Now, you could come up with a similar version of that, as Rav Lichtenstein notes in 2, that the same concept can be advanced with Chatimat Talmud as the cutoff point. Right? So we could say that there are several variations on this, right? One is, as Rav Moshe Soloveitchik said it, that those with the original smicha had authority vested in themselves, but later poskim do not. You could say that up until the Talmud, the rabbis involved could create law, and after that we only interpret it. That, for example, is the position of the Chazon Ish. I didn't give it to you. It's a very complicated text, and I want to at least get the central ideas here. But the Chazon Ish comes up with the following claim, that basically, in the context of treifot, right, which illnesses or wounds are considered deadly to animals and therefore render them not kosher, he says that which things count was determined in the time of the Talmud. Because Torah is only created, there's this odd agadic statement or cryptic agadic statement in Avodah Zarah, which says the world is divided into 6,000 years, 3 2,000-year periods. The first 2,000 are tohu, are the years of nothingness. The middle 2,000 are the years of Torah, and then the last 2,000 years are the years of Mashiach. And the way the Chazon Ish understands it is that middle 2,000 years, which mostly ends around the closing of the Mishnah and maybe the Gemara, right? It starts more or less around Avraham, right? Because Avraham, in the traditional count, is born in 1948 from the creation of the world, and goes till about the closing of the Mishnah a little bit later. That's when Torah is created, and after that, it's only interpreted. The Dor Rabbi has an even more radical model, which I'm not going to bring up right now. If you want to look at it, you can look in the Hakdama to Dor Rabbi. It's translated online on the tradition website by Rabbi Yaakov Elman. However you cut it, though, what this theory says is that originally, again, psak was binding because of the person who said it. And nowadays, that's not what poskim are even trying to do. What they're trying to do is convey to you what the theoretical law means, and if it is compelling, so it, rather than the person, is binding. Now, Rabbi Yochanan in 3 himself rejects this. He notes it's a radical thesis, both conceptually and practically, with potentially momentous implications for the implementation of halacha. Legal decisions obviously entail 2 components: elucidation of the code or the rule and assessment of the particular situation to which it is to be applied. Juridic authority is originally empowered to deal with both components, and the obligation to submit to its dicta encompasses both. One violates lo tasrom davar she'agidu l'cha yamin u'smol. Thou shalt not deviate from the injunction from the sentence which they shall declare unto thee to the right or left, by challenging the Sanhedrin's factual determination, no less than by rejecting its theoretical conclusion. Yet, and this is where it gets very important, if one accepts Rav Moshe's contention, this ought not to be the case with respect to late periods. If a posek is only an interpretive reference guide to halachic sources, one might accept his rendering of the content of the halachic corpus, but rely upon one's own judgment in evaluating the facts. Right? So Rabbi Yochanan says he himself rejects the strong version of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik. He says it can't be, right? Essentially, he notes that for Rav Moshe, a corollary of Rav Moshe is that since modern poskim are not trying to poskin directly, they're trying to tell you what the law says, and it's only binding insofar as it's compelling. It's easy for a posek, for a lay person to say, listen, I respect Rabbi X's read of the Talmud, but I know dishwashers better than he does. I understand colors better than they do. And therefore, I can poskin on the kashrut of dishwashers better than they can. I can poskin on, I had a friend when I was in Smicha who was also a graphic designer, and he said that he found, nida questions that depended on color to be particularly easy because he has a very sensitive eye to different shades of colors. So someone could say, listen, I respect Rabbi X, but I don't I don't think that they know color better than I do. I respect Rabbi X, but I don't think he knows medicine better than I do. And therefore, I'll talk to them. I'll listen to what they say about the theoretical law. But I'm going to make the decision about whether it applies to reality or not. Now, again, Rabbi Yochanan himself doesn't think this is true. He does think that maybe a posek has more authority over the theoretical law than the reality, but he's not willing to completely reject the notion that poskim weigh in on the real world. But here Rabbi Yochanan does something fascinating. And this is why, right, we've talked about a lot of different case studies, but Rabbi Yochanan notes something that is extremely striking. And he says, the application of this dichotomy to the contemporary scene would neutralize much of the critique of modern orthodoxy, but also neutralize much else, and he rejects it. Now, what does he mean? So he goes on to explain that when we talk about reality, so far we've talked about relatively narrow things. We've talked about specific medical facts. We've talked about, dishwashers. We talked about smoking, but the truth is that much of our worldview, right, our entire worldview, is built on the assessment of reality. What do I mean? So let's take two big examples. Um, let's say everyone could theoretically agree that it is permitted to, I don't know, engage in secular culture. This is what Rav Lichtenstein is really thinking about. If it would enhance your religious worldview rather than detract from it. Let's say everyone said that. And then you have a group of Haredi poskim who say, but I'm convinced that if you read literature, if you engage in philosophy, then that will take you away from Judaism. And you look at the world and you say, listen, I respect your theoretical understanding. And I agree with you that in theory, if someone would read philosophy and that would take them away from Judaism, it would be problematic. But I know that in my life, it enhances the way I think about Judaism. My engagement with the modern world enhances my religious life. So Rav Lichtenstein notes that facts are not just local. Right, as I said, the title of this article was Legitimization of Modernity, because what Rav Lichtenstein says is, why was it legitimate, essentially, for an entire community in America to follow the ideals of Rabbi Soloveitchik and create a world of modern Orthodoxy and reject the countless Haredi rabbis who said that the entire project of modern Orthodoxy was flawed? Well, Lichtenstein says because in the end of the day, their assessment was less about the theoretical values of Torah, and it was about the way they assessed the modern world. They see the modern world primarily as a threat, whereas Rabbi Soloveitchik saw it as an opportunity. And the choice of whether one joins the world of modern Orthodoxy or joins the world of the Haredi world is less about theoretical law. It's about assessing the world. How do you look at the world? Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? And if you really believe that the role of a posek is to determine the theoretical law and they don't have authority over the fact pattern, that they can't interpret the world for you, then your entire ideology might be built right based on a rejection of their interpretation of the world. Or to take another example, Zionism, right? So much of the embrace of religious Zionism wasn't about theory. It was about, do I believe that what I'm looking at is, as the Sadmar Rebbe would have it, a Maaseh Satan, that the creation of the Jewish state is a satanic deception meant to take religious Jews away from God? Or does it look to me like a miracle that I have to thank God for? Right? In the end of the day, so much of that is wrapped up in how do you read reality? Not how do you read theory? How do you read reality? So Rav Lichtenstein notes that the question of, is reality something that poskim don't have a monopoly over? Is that something that your average person can look at the world and say, I think I understand the world better than that rabbi, with all due respect? That provides a very powerful tool to embrace what in the broad scope of orthodoxy is a minority view, like modern orthodoxy, or for much of history, religious Zionism. And therefore, what you realize just in these comments by Rav Lichtenstein is that the power of what we're analyzing here, right? The ability to say that perhaps there are certain types of things, like the assessment of the world, that are outside of the purview of poskim, puts a tremendous amount of power back in the hands of your average person to say, I see the world in a certain way, and I'm going to choose a religious ideology based on the way that which I think is true to the way I understand the world around me, right? And by taking that tool out of the hand of poskim and putting it back, therefore, presumably in the hand of everybody else, right? It gives a tremendous amount of power to people and legitimacy to people to choose their world, right? To choose the world that they think they're living in, and to incorporate halacha and incorporate the Torah in the way that they think the world actually is. So just that I think highlights just how much is at stake in the types of questions that we're asking here. I think for now I'm going to skip 4. But it's worth just noting that in 4, Wilhelmstein articulates his own position, which is that despite the complexity, it is the responsibility of Poskim to at least try to be experts in the reality. And he brings the Rav case, the case of the 18 months on the farm, as his paradigm. But I'm going to leave that aside. Okay, so this was the 20 minutes that was finishing up last week, but it was making very important points. Anyone want to weigh in on this? Because again, this just highlights how much is that can be at stake in a case like this. Yeah, anyone want to weigh in on this point? I'll turn off the share for a second. Okay, fine. So let's move. Oh, Richard, did you want to see you turned on? No. Okay. Okay. So let's move to part 2 for today. One thing that has been very, very striking in everything that we've seen, all 5 models that we've seen, is that no one has mentioned anything about the effect that ideology has on assessing reality. But that seems to, but the reality is that the line between ideology and fact is not always clear. I'm not going to go as far as some epistemic movements that claim that there's no such thing as facts, right? There's only ideology. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true, but it is definitely the case that our ideals and our biases and the like affect the way we look at the world, right? If we are, sorry, to make this clear, let's take the case we started with. Eating on Yom Kippur. If someone grew up really valuing Yom Kippur, then in an ambiguous case, right? People grow up valuing Yom Kippur and fasting on Yom Kippur. And the notion of eating on Yom Kippur is a scary thought. It's against the nature of the day. If they see an ambiguous case where it's not clear that there's danger, they are more likely to err on the side of saying, why don't you at least try to fast? On the other hand, if somebody thinks that religion is all crazy, and therefore the notion that you should fast because God said so is insane, then if someone comes to them and says, my religion tells me that I'm supposed to fast, here's my medical situation, should I fast? They're much more likely to say this whole notion of fasting is crazy, and therefore at the slightest sign of danger, they might err to the side of saying eat, even if it's not warranted by the facts. And therefore, starting several hundred years ago, and this has been incorporated into classic psak, the Tiferet Yisrael says as follows, right? This is on the Yom Kippur case. He says the rule, as we've seen, is that you feed the person who's sick, al pi bikiin, on the basis of experts, afilu rofe akum. In principle, he says, listen, you can ask any doctor. You can ask a Jewish doctor. You can ask a non-Jewish doctor. Im omer kishayit'aneh efshar sheyistakein ma'chilin. If the doctor says that they will, that if they fast, they will be in danger, they might be in danger, ma'chilin oto. ולפי עניות דעתי העידנא יש להתיישב בדבר דבעיני ראיתי דשווקו להימנותיו דלכל חולי קל אומרים תמיד כשיתענה יסתכם. But it seems to me that many doctors have lost their trustworthiness For every light illness, they always say that if she fasts, she will be in danger. Right? The Tiferet Yisrael notes that in principle, the religion, the ideology of the doctor that you turn to does not matter. But in practice, it does. In practice, the question of whether you care about Yom Kippur or think that Yom Kippur is ridiculous will affect how seriously you try to understand the case, how flippantly you're willing to just say, break Yom Kippur. Now, what is the import of that? So, as becomes clear as this comment gets incorporated into later um, halachic authorities, is once you say that in principle, in theory, rabbis aren't in control of the facts, and we turn over the facts to outside experts, but you need to make sure that the outside experts share the values of Torah and therefore aren't improperly coloring the halacha or their assessment of reality in light of an ideology that is antithetical to the Torah. Who makes that decision, right? Who gets to decide that the doctor shares Torah values? Presumably, the rabbi, because the realm of Torah values is in the realm of, well, Torah. That seems like a subtle move, right? It seems like a subtle move because now we're introducing, let's say, a sixth model, right? Again, we had the five models that Poskim outsource their assessment of reality to experts. They claim no authority over expertise. They claim full authority over expertise. They claim the ability to understand experts, or we actually don't want Poskim to have full expertise, but we're okay with some expertise. But now we're introducing another model, which is even when Poskim don't claim direct authority, they maintain the power to assess the religious sensibilities of the people weighing in. Now, that seems like a subtle point, but it's actually a tremendously powerful tool because this case is relatively narrow and it comes up a lot. But there are certain questions which the entire discipline hangs on this question. So I'm going to pause for a second, right? Can you think of questions or types of questions where they seem like factual questions, but in truth, or not in truth, because ideology is so much a part of them, the ability, giving the power to the posek to determine the ideological kashrut of the expert gives them control over the entire discipline. Yeah, Richard.
I think we saw this in spades and quite damaging in both directions with COVID, especially early on, where some of the experts were saying certain kinds of congregating were okay, but don't congregate in your church or synagogue. And so then the religious leaders reacted perhaps too much the other way, saying, well, if you're going to do it that way, then everybody should just come back together and risk COVID. And so I think there was a tremendous fight.
Good, right? So COVID was an interesting example because it's like the Yoma case, it's a medical case, right? It's a medical case. The problem is that it's less simple than a medical case because it's a balance. We all understand that you can't just shut down the entire world because of minor danger, right? And you have to recognize that there are economic downsides and psychological health downsides and the like to shutting down society. So the guidelines that you give, by definition, aren't purely medical, right? They're a combination of their medical policy, right? They're informed by medicine, but there's a value judgment there of what types of gatherings are worthwhile to risk, right? The same way that, and then there's the question. So the questions of balancing a certain fact pattern here and a certain you want to call it ideology, you want to call it values, you want to call it how you weigh counter values. That was very much at play in the COVID, and my mother is here. She can talk about this more than I can. She came out of retirement to work with the government on on COVID in New York. My mother's an epidemiologist for decades, so she definitely has more. She has tremendous amount to say on these topics. But yeah, COVID was a very good example. It's a medical case, but it isn't exactly medical. It is medical. It's medically informed, right? But there are other things. So, for example, um, you know, young people who made the decision to be in pods with their kids because they recognized that the danger was low for them, um, and they needed an outlet for themselves, and it was worth risking getting COVID for themselves and maybe even their kids because they were at low risk. That wasn't, they weren't denying that there was a risk. They were just saying that it was worth weighing it. The question of then whether they went to visit their elderly grandparents, right? And whether, right, was a second question. And then I know there were some elderly people who said, listen, I'm immunocompromised because I'm older. I don't want I don't want to get sick. Don't come near me. There were other people who said, listen, why am I living if not to see my family? And it's not worth being locked in, right? Those aren't direct medical things, right? There were certain people who said it's a 10% risk and I'm willing to take that risk. And certain people said, I'm not willing to take that risk. That's that's not a direct medical question. It's a question of what risk should be swallowed, right? That's a medical policy question. So good, right? That's a medical question. But you see that even by medical questions, there are value judgments that have to be made. um, to me, probably the most important modern case of this, and I wasn't sure I could include all the sources for you inside, so I'm going to say it outside, but I think that's fine, is the case of mental health, right? Because mental health is medical, but is not, is more intertwined with ideological commitments than what we think of as classic medicine, right? It just is, right? The question of normal and the like is not purely medical. There's a value component to it. And Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig, in his excellent book, Nafshi B'Sheilati, basically does a historical survey of how Poskim came to be comfortable with mental health in halacha. So I gave you at the end, if you want the references to it, this is pages, what did I put on this? 1 second. I put it at the end of the source sheet here. I'll just show you. I didn't include the actual text because it was too many pages, I think, to include without getting permission from the publisher. But here, it's pages 50 to 54. I'm in Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig's and Dr. Shmuel Harris's Nafshi B'Sheilati. It's 50 to 54 in the Hebrew. I'm not 100% sure where it is in the English. I have the Hebrew one, but I know it's been published in English since then. But I'll share with you his summary of this. Sorry. Yeah. So for example, he said, when psychology started, right, what was the dominant theory of psychology in the world? Right? What was who led it? This is not a trick question, right? It was Freud, right? Not surprisingly, Freudian ideas did not find favor with many rabbis for a few reasons. One was obviously the over-sexualization of Freud on psychology, which created ideological dilemmas for Poskim. The second was something that Poskim shared with many scientists who critiqued Freud, was he didn't demand experimentation or evidence, right? If you've ever read some of Freud's works like Dora, right, you can't win with him. If she said what he agreed with, what he wanted her to say, then it proved his point. If she said the opposite of what he thought, then she was in denial and it proved his point, right? There was no experimentation, there was no evidence whatsoever. So the combination of the ideological problems and their empirical questions on Freud's method meant that when psychology first started, Poskim basically didn't accept the insights of psychology. They didn't care because it didn't, right? The entire system was ideologically suspect. However, as psychology developed and other theories and other methods became prevalent. So, for example, one of the very prominent theories of and practices of psychology nowadays is cognitive behavioral therapy. Right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, A, relies on harder data than Freudian psychology, and also is less theoretical, right? It's focused on solving problems, right? Like simple things like exposure therapy, that if someone is afraid of dogs, so then they should go and spend time near dogs. They should slowly come closer to dogs, and eventually they will get used to dogs. The notion of having a discipline that is more based on data and is also less theoretical, right? Trying to get into your mind and more just saying, listen, we have a problem, let's solve it. That is much more similar to the way halacha works, right? The way halacha works in medicine, if you look at the original passages in the Talmud, it says, how do I know that that a medicine works? Well, I try it a few times, and if it works on a few times for different people for the right types of right types of illness, etc., then it's considered a medicine that works halachically. So the more empirical and practical focus, plus the removal of like the theoretical and the problematic theoretical things of Freud, opened the door for Poskim to slowly become more comfortable with psychology. And if you look at the history of Poskim, you'll see this is true. That, for example, review Yisrael Yaakov Kanievsky, the Stipler, when psychology first, when he was writing in, let's say, the 1950s, I think, he said, I won't incorporate mental health into halacha. I won't respect psychology because most psychologists were heretics, which was true, right? They were mostly Jewish heretics like Freud or Jung or whatever. And you have comments like that in Rebelio Dessler, in Ramosha Feinstein, in Rebel Yashiv, in Rav Gestetner. Some poskim, like Ramosha Sternbach, went farther, and they said psychologists are actively pushing you to go against halacha, right? They're telling you to embrace, I don't know, well, in the case of Freud, right, just accept all the, the pent up sexual energy, the psychology that says, the some of it was solipsistic and the like, and all of that led to these poskim rejecting much of early psychology. But as it went on, again, and psychologists started to speak in a language that poskim were more comfortable with, that was more data driven, that was more practical and less theory. Poskim started to take it into account, right? They started to take it into account. I'll give one example and I'll open it up. The notion that ideology, especially mental health, is really important to gauging it. An example that I love using, this is in Dr. David Greenberg and Eliezer Witzam wrote a book years ago called Sanity and Sanctity, Mental Health Among the Ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem. This was written in 2001. They note that psychologists often don't understand religious patients, and that's a problem, not just, a little problem. It's a problem in assessment. And they give the following example. They said that let's say you have a person who he washes his hands, right? Every time he comes in the door, he's so afraid of germs. He opens the door, he takes off his shoes, takes off his shirt, goes and he washes his hands in a very precise way with scalding hot water and soap, and then he puts on hand sanitizer, right? Throws all his clothes in the laundry. Every time he goes in and out of the house, right? Someone like that you might diagnose with OCD, anxiety disorder, and the like. If you have somebody else who says that every morning when they wake up, the first thing they do is go to the sink and they take a cup, and that cup has to have at least X number of ounces of water in the cup. And then they have to wash their right hand and then their left hand, and their right hand and then their left hand, and their right hand and then their left hand. And then they have to say a specific formula of words, and then they have to dry their hands. Right? An outsider might look at that person and say, it's the same thing, it's the same anxiety, it's the same OCD. An insider knows that that's just describing Netilat Yadayim, right? That's just, you wash your hands in the morning and you say a bracha. And their point was determining whether someone is suffering from OCD or not often requires figuring out, right, whether it's an aberration from the culture that they're within. In order to be able to assess that, you need to enter their space, right? You can't come and say, I don't believe in religion, and therefore I determine that halacha is obsessive compulsive and therefore unhealthy. Because if you do that, then that's not a scientific statement, that's an ideological statement. You have to say within the framework that you believe, what you're doing is an aberration and therefore unhealthy. So if someone comes and says, you're saying, you're repeating Shema so many times that you don't complete the text before the end of Zman Kriyat Shema, so then they can say within your own value system, your obsession is leading to the undermining of halacha, which is your value, right? It's an internal critique. But all of that highlights that both the historical component, but also the practical component, that mental health, right? The choice of accepting mental health as something real that Poskim have to engage with, which is where the world is now, that Poskim are comfortable for the most part, acknowledging that mental illnesses are real and therefore have halachic implications. While it's really just a reality question, it's not, because psychology incorporates a value judgment in ways that are much more intense than, let's say, classic medicine. And therefore, this Tiferet Yisrael, right, that's where we started. The Tiferet Yisrael who says, listen, that yes, rabbis defer to doctors, but rabbis have to determine whether the doctors they're talking to share the values of Torah and can be trusted to weigh in authentically. That has a little bit of power in cases like, which doctor do you ask whether I should fast on Yom Kippur? But once you open the door to saying that it is the job of the posek to ensure that the experts that are giving opinions for halacha, that their ideology is not at odds with Torah, you realize in the case of mental health and halacha, you're giving them tremendous power. Because if the posek decides psychology is Freudian, and therefore in principle is anti-Torah, then they determine that mental health doesn't count. It doesn't exist. It just ideologically doesn't exist. So yes, the rabbi will say, I acknowledge that for medical questions, I turn to doctors, but because of ideological commitments, I deny that Freudian psychology is a medical assessment. And when they then come and say, but a psychologist who's following cognitive behavioral therapy, that's real medicine because it's experimental and it's not ideological and it's practical and it's solving problems. And therefore, I accept their ideological commitments, and therefore I count them as doctors, right? They've now created a discipline called mental health in halacha. Um, so you realize that that small move that the Tiferes Yisrael made, which was recognize that the line between facts and values, between facts and ideology, is not always 100% clear, has narrow implications, like which doctor do you ask to eat, whether you should eat on Yom Kippur, but also has really far-reaching implications, like do I accept the notion of mental health as a category that halacha cares about? And realizing the types of things that are at stake, right? When you, by introducing the ability of a posek to frame factual questions based on whether they accord ideologically with halacha, you realize just how much power that gives. There's another historical example that I really want to give, but I'll take it if anyone wants to comment now. Otherwise, I'll take like a few minutes to give another fascinating historical example. I don't think we'll get to Land for Peace, and we'll leave that for next week, which is how this plays out when we move to political questions, which is, I think, another really fascinating one. But before that, I want to give. Well, okay, I'll take 2 minutes to give this example. Mo's Kahana is a fascinating, not to be confused with Meir Kahana, not the same person. Mo's Kahana is a professor of intellectual Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, and he has an excellent book called Tarnagolet B'li Lev, a chicken without a heart, which is an analysis of basically the emergence of modern science and medicine and how it affected the halachic world. And he notes, sorry, that we often think that, the world just accepted, I don't know, modern medicine at some point, and rabbis at some point came along for the ride. But he notices historically that that's not actually true. At the beginning, when medicine was shifting from Galen to what we would recognize as modern medicine, there were huge debates in the rabbinic community about not whether we should accept doctors. Everyone agrees we should accept doctors. Whether we should continue following Galen, which medicine had for thousands of years, or whether we should accept this newfangled modern medicine. For some poskim, it was accidental, right? For some poskim, it was accidental. Those, if they went to medical school, they started to be exposed to it early. They accepted modern medicine. If not, so they knew their old doctors back home who had been Galen influenced. That was true for some people. But there were certain poskim that actually said that they refused to accept modern medicine, and they went with Galen, right? They went with classic medicine because Galen recognized the role of the spirit in physical health, and modern medicine was reductionist and rejected the role of the spirit. And therefore, they ideologically opposed the values of modern medicine, therefore were convinced that Galen must still be right. And what Kahana notes is that the question of accepting modern medicine for many poskim was actually a fight over what ideals do we think medicine should be shaped by. Do we think that medicine is illegitimate if it doesn't recognize the role of the spirit? Or do we think it's legitimate to talk about medicine in purely empirical terms? And therefore, what seems like a scientific question, which is, do I accept Galen or do I accept modern medicine, was for many poskim an ideological question, which is, which theory, again, this isn't a question. The poskim are not claiming to be doctors. What they're claiming is that the two different schools of medicine, which again, remember, this isn't, hindsight is 2020. We look back and we say, obviously modern medicine was right. But in the moment, it wasn't clear. They grew up trusting doctors who followed Galen. And now these new scientists are coming and say, you got it all wrong. So for some poskim, it was just a question, how much do I embrace newness? But for some poskim, It was, I can't accept modern medicine because it removes the spirit. It's anti-religious. And other people said, why? Right? Just because spirit isn't part of medicine doesn't mean it's not important, right? This isn't anti-religious. And for many of these people in the 17th, 18th century, the question of whether to accept modern medicine was a question of whether it ideologically lined up with the way they thought about Judaism. So you very quickly realize between this example and the mental health in halacha that the importance of whether or not Poskim have the right to say that even if I don't claim to be an expert, Torah values is my job. And therefore, I maintain the right to tell you which experts are trustworthy and which ones are not. That leaves a tremendous amount of power in the hands of Poskim, and highlights how hard it is to actually divide between facts and values, between theory and practice, because it's not always that clear. Okay, those are the examples I wanted to give. I guess next week, let me just tell you what I want to do next week, and I'll open for questions. I want to do two things. One is I want to do the land for peace case to highlight how this plays out in politics, which is even touchier than maybe some of the issues we talked about today. And I want to share a theory of how modern technology, specifically artificial intelligence, shifts the way we think about who's in charge of the reality based on insights from, among other people like Eric Topol, who are, if you know Eric Topol's writings, he's a cardiologist, but he's very interested in the impact of technology and the way we think about medicine. So those are the two things I want to cover next week. But for now, I'll open to questions on what or comments of what we just said, because I don't think we'll be able to do those justice.
Okay, so feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask questions. You can also write them in the chat. Eliana, do you have a question? No, okay.
Okay, so I mean, I can give some other examples, just to highlight some of these points. I just don't want to rush through the political one. But Rabbi Judah Goldberg has also documented that the that the one second. The question of how much do you believe that there's a mind-body relationship? How much do you not? That's also a very critical one. Poskim traditionally followed certain models of medicine, which are like very close connection between the mind-body dynamic. And based on that, Poskim things like Ramosha Feinstein has a lot of tshuva that you can't pass over patients, even if they're terminally ill, because simply passing over them to try to save someone else will make them be depressed and will lead to them dying sooner, and things like that. Judah Goldberg, who's both a rabbi and a doctor, says that sometimes Poskim overstated the mind-body connection, and therefore led to psakim that, as far as he's concerned as a doctor, doesn't stand up to medical scrutiny. But again, he said Poskim there seem to not just be making a medical claim, right? They seem to be attracted to the more expansive views of the mind-body connection, because that implies a role for, again, the mind, the spirit, and the like. So Ray Goldberg says that, yeah, that's another example where many Poskim are very influenced by theories that embrace the impact of the mind-body connection to extent that may not be justified by modern science. And what do you do with that when you see that Poskim are making more than just factual claims? Okay, if no one has questions, I'll just summarize what we've seen today. Oh, Richard. Okay.
And if this is irrelevant, we can pass it by. I just wonder, right? There's a certain sort of famous idea from Rabbi Yehuda Levi and the Rav Kook maybe, and versus the Rambam, are non-Jews qualitatively different than Jews? Does that affect then how rabbis poskim, that they're in the one camp or
Um,
another?
so it does. I wrote an article about this many, many years ago when I was in college still. But yes, in the extremist form, there is a Chatam Sofer that says that because the Gemara says in one place that um, because non-Jews eat bugs, right? They eat shkatzim urimasim. It causes their body to heat up in different ways. Um, he therefore says that on a matter of principle, he rejects all medical experiments and medical tests that were done on non-Jews for Jews, because Jews and non-Jewish bodies are different because their bodies are heated differently. So yes, the potential for saying something like, if you believe something like that Jews and non-Jews, their body is physically different, then you might reject all of modern medicine because it's based on experiments mostly of non-Jews. And the claim that we accept modern medicine is a rejection of a far-reaching ideology like that, which again, Chalam Sofer says in Avodah Zarah. So 100%, right? Questions like how do you view the relationship between Jews and non-Jews? 100% have those that can affect the way you assess data because you have an ideological commitment about how you interpret facts. So yes, 100%. Yes, I can try to dig up this article where I made that point in college. And see whether I still see what I still agree with it. It was a long time ago.
Ironically, that is a huge issue, right? A lot of people have said that too many experiments have been done on white men, and so the medical advice doesn't necessarily apply properly to women or to blacks, and that there is
So
actually in the scientific world, there are issues. Now, whether bugs is the factor, I don't know, but
right. So it's interesting because you also have to figure out how much is that an ideological question and how much is that a medical question, right? In the there's a book. What is it called? It's uh Hidden Women, maybe I forget what it is, but it's a book entirely about this point, right? Which is does the fact that women weren't included in the studies, medically speaking, right? Does that mean that some of the research is bad and not healthy for women? And at least in certain cases, it seems the answer is yes, right? That because of biological differences between men and women, certain medications don't work as well on women, and that's a real problem. Now that's somewhere between a ideological question and a medical question, and so yes, right. And you could obviously come at it in different directions, right? You can posit that there's no differences, or you can posit that we have to respect each person where there is. But yeah, there's a lot of medical discussion about things like that. Obviously there's also ethical questions of whether we should accept medical research that was done in an unethical way, right? That's a case where, right, this was an issue obviously with data that came from the Nazis, but it's been an issue since then that bioethicists struggle with, and the question of whether we can accept data that was done in unethical experiments is both an ideological question and a factual question. So yes, there are many different things that go on this. I see we have a question from Miriam in the chat. The doctor is not because is willing to accept that her mental health patient is serious about halacha. Would we accept her input for making an halacha decision? So I think the answer would be potentially if the doctor is not bikoris but actually respects people's values enough to answer seriously within their own worldview, probably, right? There are many people who themselves don't believe in God, but believe in people's right to live within their own value system. And there are other people who want to impose their own values. Presumably, it would come down to how much you trust someone to be honest in their assessment of your situation. Okay, so like I said, the two things that we're not going to cover everything in this topic, but the two things I do want to cover next week are one, bring one example of how this plays out in politics, which is I'll use the land for peace case, and then share some of my thoughts on where modern technology, specifically AI, is going to push the way we balance these issues. I think that's all we're going to have time for because we only have 4 weeks here. to my great chagrin, because I could go on for months on this. But I guess we'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, everyone who joined us today, and also everyone who always participates in our classes here at Risha. And thank you so much, Rabbi Ziring, for this very interesting class. Can't wait for next week. And for now, lehitraot.